Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Adam Scamihorn. Adam is a product director at InterVision Systems, which is a leading managed service provider delivering and supporting complex IT solutions for mid to enterprise and public sector organizations. Adam, thank you for joining us for our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Thank you, Boris. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. Excited to talk about it.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Adam, could you tell us, first of all, your short story about yourself and your career path, what brought you to where you are right now, and what you guys at InterVision System are up to these days?
Absolutely. So I have been with InterVision for a little over 11 years, been working in business continuity, disaster recovery, and risk for about 15 years total. About 10 years ago, I helped launch the disaster recovery as a service, DRAS service that would eventually become InterVision's leading product there from a delivery standpoint. So I was leading the operations team that delivered DRAS really before that acronym even existed. And very early on was involved with lots of organizations kind of figuring out how to do DR as the cloud was becoming more and more popular. About 5 years ago, shifted from being on the delivery side of things to kind of taking over the product side. So we, at InterVision, we'd had our own data centers. We'd been doing DRAS to kind of more traditional VMware-powered data centers, and moved into product, took some of that knowledge as we brought it into other cloud spaces, to AWS, to Azure, and kind of took what we had learned to the next level. After doing that, one of the things we noticed was happening is in our own service, there were a lot more disasters actually being declared. And so we saw things specifically like ransomware and other cyber attacks impacting organizations' business. And we knew we had to evolve what we were doing, because traditional disaster recovery was designed kind of for things like natural disasters, hardware failures, human error. And there was a lot more complexity that needed to be added in order to protect that data and protect environments from cyber attacks. And so we evolved what we were doing traditionally with machine and data disaster recovery with a more security focus. And so over the last 3 years, we've kind of been evolving traditional DRAS and mixing it with additional things like managed detection and response and governance programs and red team capabilities like penetration testing and vulnerability testing in order to evolve the way we do disaster recovery and help organizations recover very, very quickly and respond very quickly when they are hit with those types of cyber attacks. And so that's led me up to today, where I'm now the product director of all of our business continuity services. So I lead still our disaster recovery programs and continue to grow and evolve what we're doing there, as well as our security programs that are focused on both detection and response and vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, those kind of more red team type activities.
Fantastic. So I believe that we will have a very thoughtful conversation on the topic of increased sophistication of ransomware and how organizations can evolve to protect them from this disease threats. Sorry. So because ransomware continues to be the biggest threat to IT leaders, and now even ransomware service popped up. As long as people keep paying the ransom, this service will continue to grow, giving them more resources to make their attacks increasingly sophisticated. So, Adam, can you explain the current state of ransomware attacks and how they have evolved in terms of sophistication and complexity?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the ways they've evolved, they've just gotten easier. You mentioned ransomware as a service. This idea that you can go out and essentially buy kits to, within 2 or 3 steps, infiltrate and take down servers and desktops and workstations. And so historically, we've known threat actors get into environments and they kind of sit there and they look around, they make sure they know what's happening in an environment. It's called dwell time. It's this idea that while they get into an environment, they're not necessarily attacking it right away. And with these types of kits, once someone finds a way in, whether that's through a phishing attack or some type of vulnerability exploitation, they're able to very quickly exploit what's actually inside that environment once they have access. And through those types of kits, we saw a little bit of a slowdown last year with the Conti breakup, as they kind of separated, and you had a Russia faction and a Ukrainian faction. But now those factions have kind of gotten back into their own 2 separate groups, and we've seen it spike again. And, you know, these types of threat actors are lazy, right? They don't want to be doing a lot of work for this type of money. And they want to hit as many things as possible. Verizon's data breach investigation report last year did a whole write-up of the financial outcomes of being a threat actor. And so they actually showed that, you know, if you hit X number of organizations, this is when you become profitable. And then this is when you become extremely profitable. And they showed a roadmap how an individual could utilize those ransomware type kits to easily make $600,000 a year. And that's pretty appealing, right? So on top of having these organized crime syndicates that are still a big threat, you've also got other threat actors for one reason or another. And primarily the number one reason ransomware is instituted is because there's a financial gain to be made. And it used to be thought, hey, this is only big organizations, right? But the truth is, everyone's going to pay a significant amount of money to keep their business running. And so very quickly, we've realized everyone's at risk, right? There's no one who's not regulated enough or not big enough to be a target, because if you've got income, someone else wants that money. And this is an easy way to take that if you're not prepared for it.
So how do ransomware attackers typically gain access to an organization system? Is it a phishing attack or something else, or perhaps somebody employee that kind of stealing passwords?
There are all kinds of graphs and a lot of data out there about what the different ways people get in, but more than half, based off of whoever's data you're looking at, are caused by someone within an organization or some vulnerability from a human level getting in, which is often phishing. There's all kinds of different ways to potentially get those passwords and get in from a user standpoint. But it's almost always, I shouldn't say almost always, but it's very frequently, and more than 50% of the time, caused by someone being exploited in their own access to an environment. That being said, there's still external vulnerabilities, and we've seen, obviously, supply chains to individual software capabilities being exploited over the years as well. So those are all possible ways an attacker gets in. And it's important to kind of know your environment for where those gaps can be. And that's, I mentioned the red team idea of having someone take a look both outside in and once they're inside, what the vulnerabilities look like, what the capabilities of a threat actor would be in an individual's environment.
All right. So I would like to ask you a personal point of view.
Yeah.
What is a commonly held belief or major misconception in the field of ransomware that you are strongly disagree with or want to debunk or something like that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of them, but I'm going to pick on one specifically because I've got a disaster recovery background. I've spent a lot of time with different recovery software, and there's a lot of really good data movers out there to do disaster recovery. And so we run into this all the time where people buy really good tools, but they don't necessarily architect it correctly for disaster recovery against a ransomware attack. And the really common misconception is I can restore instantly into my own data center. And the data mover companies, all of them, I'm not going to name any names, but all of the big ones, they all claim this. And technically it's true, but it doesn't work during an incident response. And there's lots of reasons why. The number one reason is if you've been hit with a ransomware attack, your data center is now a crime scene. And if you talk to the security guys, the incident response teams, the CISOs, they're going to be worried about what's happened in that environment, understanding the indicators of compromise, isolating it, but also understanding it. Usually there's forensics that need to happen. And so restoring back into that production data center isn't a viable solution while that investigation is happening. And so once you've got law enforcement involved, legal teams involved, insurance involved, they're not usually going to let organizations just power everything back on and write it over the top of all of the forensics that need to happen in that data center. And so what you really need in those instances is offsite, immutable, meaning that it cannot be changed, it cannot be deleted, it cannot be overwritten, recoverable versions of your production environment that can be stood up in a clean space, completely separate and isolated from production. And so that idea of instant recovery in place really falls apart very, very quickly when an actual full-scale incident is declared. And I talked about architecting that correctly. When we talk about architecting that in that disaster recovery space that's clean, it not only needs to be isolated. A lot of people get disaster recovery and high availability confused, but it needs to be architected in a way that those two things can't really talk to each other. Yes, the data gets moved into the repository, but the networks in that disaster recovery site should have no connection back to the networks in production. Because while that's being isolated and the forensics are happening and everybody's doing the investigation, you want to be able to stand this up, scan everything for indicators of compromise, threat hunt if you need to, and then connect your end users and not have to wait for the forensics to happen over here. And we're talking, forensics can take 3 days, 7 days, sometimes 2 weeks, depending on the scale of that investigation. No organization wants to be down for that amount of time in order to be able to recover. Now, there are exceptions to that, right? We've seen use cases where there's enough of a isolated version in production where they can bring some of it up. But very few people run enough additional virtualization resources in their own data center to run everything twice. It's not practical, first of all, and it's just unlikely that that's happening. So even if they can bring up a partial, there's usually some kind of a hybrid DR solution with things in cloud or things in another place that need to be thought of for large file systems and things like that.
Right, very interesting. I thought that people had to restore directly. At least when I worked in IT about 20, 25 years ago, I know that when something fell, you just need to restore it. But there was no ransomware at that time, so no criminal investigation.
Yeah. And you don't even want to power down those source machines once they've been attacked, because the forensic team wants to know what's happening in the memory. They need to be able to scan those machines as they are. They want them isolated, but they want them powered on. And so you've got to be able to provide that team the ability to do that investigation and still recover your business. And so you got to plan for that as well. And that's not something a lot of people think about.
Mm-hmm. So in light of this increased sophistication of ransomware, how can organizations enhance their cybersecurity strategies to better protect themselves, or what proactive measures should they take?
Yeah, so understanding the processes piece is so big to being able to react to this quickly and effectively. And that means more than just DR, and it means more than just incident response, but it means that those teams need to actually begin to work together. In a lot of organizations I talk to, you've got a team of IT professionals responsible for disaster recovery, and you have a team of security professionals responsible for incident response. And they're both probably pretty good at their individual jobs, but they don't always know what their capabilities of the other teams are, even within the same organization, let alone how to work together in kind of what I just described, in that idea of bringing up disaster recovery and isolating it and doing the investigation at the same time. Often you'll get the security guys going, no, you can't turn anything on until the investigation is done. I don't want you to mess up what we're doing here. Legal's involved, law enforcement's involved, so on and so forth. Whereas the IT guys that are doing the DR are like, no, we got to get the business back up and running. We can't take orders. We want to make sure we recover all of the billing information that we got from yesterday before the attack, and those kind of things. And so you've got two conflicting goals potentially if they haven't worked together. And so to fix that, they've got to start working together. And that means doing your incident response tabletops with resources from both groups, so that the people who are understanding how DR works are working with the people who understand how to threat hunt and how to look for indicators of compromise and how to isolate disaster recovery from production. And so they can start to build plans that go into their disaster recovery playbooks that look like security and DR teams are working together. And then you need to actually test those kind of things, right? You need to be able to bring up those environments in DR, and you need to provide access to the security professionals who do need to do that search for the indicator of compromise, so that the data they get from managed detection and response, endpoint protection, can directly influence how they assure that what's in the DR site is safe to reconnect before they access that for the end user. Mm-hmm. Without testing, you're never going to know it's going to work, right? And so you've got to test. And having those two teams come together and test is, I think, the biggest evolution we're seeing make a huge difference in actually being able to respond in a crisis.
Fantastic. So, for example, if we take a life of average CISO or risk manager, if there is one thing that they should start to prioritize right now that they are not doing currently, what would it be?
One thing they should start to prioritize, I would say the word testing again, and it's going to depend on what they've done already, but you want to validate your strategy works. So that can be penetration testing. If you're doing one-time penetration testing, consider upgrading to something that's doing more continuous vulnerability scanning, both internally and externally. If you already got a really solid penetration testing, go a little bit deeper, do a business impact analysis, and start mapping the things that are impacting your environment directly to the types of scanning you're doing, so that you can understand the risk associated with the pen testing as it applies to the business impact analysis. If you're doing all of that, great, then test further into the disaster recovery piece. Bring your security experts, bring your CISO into the disaster recovery test, and start to test against scenarios that are specifically from your tabletop exercises. So your incident response capabilities that we're talking about here at a high level on a tabletop, make them a reality and run through those scenarios with the security team on the DR side. But testing is hands down the biggest gap we see, and the one thing I would recommend. If you're not testing, you're not prepared.
All right. So if we summarize our interview, so for someone who is listening to it, I would like to walk away with one or two major takeaways. What would it be?
The biggest takeaway I would say is, if you've got a great disaster recovery plan from more than 3 years ago, it's probably not a great disaster recovery plan against ransomware. And so take another look at that disaster recovery plan. Make sure you're involving the security team. Make sure you've got immutable repositories where people cannot delete or change what's in your DR site. And then make sure it's isolated away from your production, so that an attacker's threat landscape doesn't extend into the disaster recovery site.
Mm-hmm. All right, Adam, that were all my questions. Perhaps if I forgot something and you would like to add anything to our audience that will benefit them, please go ahead.
Thinking here.
Oh, can you hear? Oh, okay.
I
So
don't think I've got
Adam,
anything else to add, but I would say, if you're looking for that first step, InterVision's got a great, very early on first assessment that's based off of insurance companies' controls that they put in place. So cyber insurance is becoming harder to get, and it's based off of both our recovery and our cybersecurity analysis. It's very easy. You can take this for free assessment. We call it the Cyber Risk Maturity Assessment. And it's based off of those 3 other assessments. It's a watered down, simplified version, but it will point out gaps and help you kind of understand that first step. So if that's something you're interested in, I'd point you towards InterVision's site, and that's something we can help organizations do completely free. You got to figure out what that next step is to help harden your organization.
all right, fantastic, Adam. Thank you very much again for this interview. Perhaps we can, in a few months, we can collaborate with other guys from your company to speak about other topics. But it was very useful to hear your opinion.
Thank you, Boris. I appreciate your time.